Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for our virtual teach-in, Environmental Transformation in Times of Crisis. I'm Fazila Jiwa, and this event is hosted by Fernwood Publishing as part of Radical May. Radical May is a month-long virtual book fair featuring online events and book sales from radical publishers all around the world. The pandemic that we're facing right now has had numerous social, political, and economic implications. And it has also opened the possibility to discuss transformation of the global capitalist system that relies on resource extraction and labor exploitation. So we're really honored to share the wisdom of three of our authors on this topic tonight: Dr. Pam Palmater, Jen Goby, and David Camfield. So after each of them have spoken for about 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to pull some questions from the audience from the YouTube live chat. So if you have any questions during the event, please be sure to participate in that way. So first of all, we're going to hear from Pam Palmater. In what is colonially known as Canada, today is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And while we remember the Indigenous sisters and daughters and mothers who face disproportionate violence, we are so lucky to have Dr. Pam Palmater with us to elucidate the connections between colonial violence and crisis and environmental transformation. Pam is a Mi'kmaq citizen and member of the Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. She's been a practicing lawyer for 20 years and is currently a full professor and the chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University, and an incredible digital social justice wizard with her podcast this October, and is available for pre-order from the Fernwood website. So thank you so much, Pam, for...
Thanks so much for having me. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory, and thank you for having me on this panel. I really appreciate how Fernwood has such a strong sense of social justice and earth justice, and really brings together authors to share what we write about, what we talk about, but more importantly, what we act about. You know, we're not just about books on shelves or entertainment. This is really about engaging people to take action. And I really, really appreciate that. Tonight, I'm talking to everyone from Scugog territory. And I'm thankful that you made the acknowledgement about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, because Canada was found guilty of genocide. And it's almost been a year since the report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, and no substantive action has been taken, which is why Indigenous women all over the country are wearing red today, which is why we're trying to call out this injustice, because even though tonight and over the last few months, we've all been really focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, and rightfully so. It's a serious health risk. People are losing their lives, and it's a pandemic unlike those we've seen in the past in terms of the current modern circumstances. However, we have to remember where we're at, that just before the pandemic hit, Canada was already engaged in two massive crises. One was genocide against Indigenous women and girls. I mean, the United Nations, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Organization of American States, I mean, international people all over the world were saying, oh my goodness, Canada, you're guilty of not just historic genocide that you could apologize for and try to move on from. We're talking about historic and ongoing genocide. That's the deaths and suffering of Indigenous women and girls, which of course includes all Indigenous peoples, because we're not isolated from those. And the second crisis is that of climate change. I mean, we are facing a massive impending climate disaster that just rolls closer and closer to us each day that we don't take crisis level action to address it. I mean, we're in a situation where we've got these two crises, and the thought of going forward in any kind of way that even looks like the status quo will just mean that the genocide will continue, and so will climate change. And what I try to talk about in, my social media and my books and the new one that's coming up is how these things are very related. You can't look at them separately. I mean, colonization is a violent process that hasn't stopped. It might take different forms. It might be in different laws and policies and actions. There might be different trends over time, but ultimately it's about the violence towards Indigenous peoples and violence towards Indigenous lands. And that's how we're all here. This doesn't just impact Indigenous peoples. We're in a climate disaster because of what the world has done to Indigenous peoples, who are, keep in mind, the defenders and protectors and guardians of the lands and waters, plants and animals. So when you remove Indigenous peoples from the land, you remove that protection. And thank goodness we are still here. Thank goodness we have survived genocide to be able to still be on the front lines, to be able to do something about this climate disaster. But what that requires is that we're the ones that are on the front lines. We're the ones whose bodies are again put at risk of being hurt by law enforcement, at risk of losing our freedoms and being institutionalized in prisons like we already are. And so Canada really requires a 360 in its thinking. We cannot just think about a future where we tweak around the edges and have some environmentally friendly policies or Indigenous friendly schools. It's got to be a complete redo because climate change is the ultimate arbiter. It's not like we get to negotiate or rationalize or buy off or incorporate the climate. That's not going to get us out of this. This is about the ultimate power, very much tied to the health of Indigenous peoples. And so our collective futures really depends on the collective health of Indigenous peoples moving forward. And part of the problem here, though, is how corporatized everything has become. And I'm not just talking about in Canada, but worldwide. So the first wave of colonization, violent colonization of Indigenous peoples and lands was done by settler governments and then pre-Confederation Canadian governments. But the second wave, which is equally devastating, is the corporate colonization of Indigenous lands and bodies. And when you think about it, you've got a scenario where even though governments have the legal responsibility to act in respect of all of our inherent sovereignty and our powers and jurisdiction as governments and all of our inherent rights, be they human rights or specific native rights, all of those have been downloaded or delegated to massive transnational corporations whose only interest is making money for its shareholders. And so when all of the powers and all of the responsibilities are delegated to these, faceless corporations who hoard their funding outside of our countries, no wonder we're in this disaster. The problem is, it's a bigger challenge to fight because they have all the money, they have all of the political influence, and although the government has delegated its responsibilities to these corporations, they back up the corporations' wants and needs with regards to extraction with law enforcement. So whether it's provincial police, national police, and even the army, these transnational corporations literally have the entire military force and police force of Canada at its beck and call, essentially private security. And you don't see them paying a dime for any of that either. Now flip that around a bit and talk about Indigenous rights and what Indigenous rights mean, or Indigenous powers and sovereignty in this country. Do any of us have the ability as Indigenous peoples to call up the RCMP and say, hey, there's someone out there polluting. There's someone out there dumping in the lake, dumping in the river. There's someone out there causing murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. What is our response? You never see an army of military or police forces standing behind Indigenous peoples, helping us protect our inherent but also constitutionally protected rights to defend our territories. And that's even after the Supreme Court of Canada has said in multiple cases that Aboriginal title means exclusive use and benefit. We decide what happens on our territories. When governments water that down with their own interpretations and say, well, you know, that's kind of like consent and we'll accommodate if we think so. No, or consultation and we'll accommodate if we think so. That's a way of getting around and essentially gutting these constitutional protections. And so pre-pandemic, keep in mind where we were. Nationwide protests across the country, nationwide, and they were starting to spread into the US in defense of the Wet'suwet'en, a very singular focus. The Wet'suwet'en Nation wanted the RCMP and Coastal GasLink pipeline off their territories. And they send in the RCMP and drag these people away out of their homes in order to escort pipeline workers onto territories. Why did that ring so true to heart for Indigenous peoples and Canadians across the country? Because this isn't the first time we've seen it, and we know it's not the last time that we'll see it unless we stand up and do something about it. We've seen the RCMP and Fisheries and Oceans do the same thing to the Mi'kmaq. We've seen the Army do the same thing to the Mohawks or the Haudenosaunee all across the country. And so we were saying, no, enough is enough. We're in this massive climate disaster. And speaking of climate disaster, where were we worldwide prior to the pandemic? We had little girls, Autumn Pelche and Greta Thunberg, all over the place. You know, Autumn advocating for the water and Greta advocating for the earth, the planet, essentially, with worldwide protests, people rising up in the millions saying, we want a future. This corporate way of governing doesn't work anymore. And then, bam, the pandemic hits. And where are we? We're legally not allowed to gather in public. We're legally not allowed to be within 6 feet of one another, with one exception. If you're a miner, if you're a pipeline worker, if you're working in the extractive industry, if you're working for any of the massive corporations that keep governments rolling. And that's what I hope we really dig into tonight. I know I don't want to take up all of the time, but, you know, Indigenous peoples, we started out as sovereign nations and we still are sovereign nations. And the fact that many of us have survived genocide, have done so with an unfettered purpose to continue to defend our lands and waters from complete and utter destruction. And that benefits everybody. And the more we all come together and act in solidarity, then we will be able to do that. But it's going to require a bit of an adjustment. We're going to have to consistently adjust our tactics and our strategies and our partnerships over time to address things like this. Wow, what happens when government locks you in your house? You know, for good reason because of a pandemic, but then allows exceptions for the very evils that was causing murder to missing and causing planetary destruction to begin with. So we really kind of have to revamp and be ready when those provisions are lifted to hit the ground running to address these two crises in Canada.
Oh, thank you so much for the solid analysis and the connections between health and environment and the crises that were ongoing. We'll talk about that more in the discussion, hopefully. And I'm going to introduce our next panelist, I guess, Jen Gabi. Jen is an activist scholar and the founder of the Mud Girls Natural Building Collective, and she organizes with Climate Justice Montreal. Her work focuses on how social movements can bring about large-scale systems change. So we're incredibly happy to have Jen make the time to talk to us today. Her book is called More Powerful Together, conversations with climate activists and Indigenous land defenders, and it is out this July. You can pre-order it on the website. So thank you very much.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Thanks to Fazila and Curran at the folks at Fernwood for organizing this event and inviting me to take part in the conversation. It's a huge honor to be here with these intellectual heavyweights on this panel. So yeah, it's an honor to be here. So as a climate activist and a scholar of social transformation, I've been thinking a lot about what all this means, how this pandemic time can be most effectively seized to move to a much more fair and just and kind and ecologically viable world. But I'll be honest, like I've been largely preoccupied with worrying about my mom and hoping she's going to be okay and figuring out how to keep her company while she's isolated in her basement apartment for the last 8 weeks. And I'm sure she's watching right now. Hi, Mom. So I know I'm not alone in having these kind of preoccupations for loved ones and having scattered focus these days. Yeah, so though my mind has not been super working at high capacity these days, I will share some of the messy thoughts and reflections I've been having through this time. Let's see. I will also share some of what I've been, what's in the book in More Powerful Together, and how it relates to this crisis of COVID-19. So the book is called More Powerful Together, and it's based on 5 years of research I did for my doctoral degree at McGill. And during it, I spent many months in conversation with climate activists, organizers, and land defenders, asking what's working and what's not working in the movements you're part of. How can we build stronger movements? What's standing in our way? How can we overcome obstacles? And so the book really sort of brings all those reflections and collective strategizing together. So in chapter 5 of the book, it's really focused on the answers I got when I asked all these people, how do you think large-scale social transformation can happen? What's your theory of change? And so this chapter is based on that. It's also woven through with academic literature on social transformation as well. And one thing that rang clear from both academic and activist theories is that sometimes crises can create conditions in which transformative change becomes not only more possible, but actually necessary. This is in many different ways. For example, crisis can disrupt people's taken for granted understanding of social reality. Crisis can change people's perceived self-interest and what they will stand up for and what they'll stand up to. As an Anishinaabe land defender explained to me in one of the interviews, we need some kind of other story to take us over, and sometimes it happens through crisis and catastrophe. So change can also become more possible at these critical junctures because the people making decisions, to them, the status quo suddenly can appear less worth defending. That's hopeful. And it's in these phases when activists have the best chance of influencing events, when activists' long-term work can suddenly come to fruition. So this is all part of the sort of social theory around crisis and transformation. But for these crisis moments to actually trigger transformative change in desirable directions, we need to be paying close attention and be prepared with alternatives, viable alternatives, and be ready to seize the opportunities as they open up. As one climate organizer told me, there are windows of opportunity that are presented, often in times of crisis, often manufactured by massive systemic forces that we have no control over. And the people who are able to have massive impact in those moments are the ones who are expecting them and are organized and able to take those opportunities. And according to several people I spoke with, and echoing Naomi Klein's arguments in the book Shock Doctrine, the political right has proven better than the left at creating and seizing these crises. And they do so through a politics of fear that produces hostility towards others. And so it's not that we need to organize like the right does, that's for sure. But we do need to understand that over the last few decades, they've done an incredible job of seizing and these crises and taking over institutions. So we need to be really vigilant right now and seeing what's going on, who's trying to seize these crises besides, let's say, climate activists, who else is trying to seize them, and how is that going? So some of the key lessons from that particular chapter is that timing really matters in determining which interventions will work and when. And activists and organizers need to be really attentive to timing. opportunities and phases of change, and choose those moments and strategies accordingly. A Mi'kmaq land defender I talked to told me really about this being really attentive to the moment. He said, if we approach strategy from a rigid template, as in, if you do this every single time, follow step 1 through 10, you'll win. No, because that ignores social conditions. It ignores the cultural conditions. It ignores the resource conditions of what you have available to you, and it ignores the political will. Every place, case by case, the scenario has to be strategically analyzed to determine its vulnerabilities, to determine its opportunities. He goes on to say, that's why we say be like water, because you can't come in with a rigid template for strategy. So that's an important reminder at this moment that we need to be really responsive to this moment, not necessarily trying to do the same thing as we were doing before, because the conditions have really changed. But I've also been thinking a lot, and this goes beyond this chapter, is the way this particular pandemic is not so conducive to transformative change. Because in the scholarship, academic scholarship I read about change, it was also emphasizing that change becomes more possible when the powers that be are weak or experience these crises of legitimation, like where people are not trusting their governments anymore. And the powers that be, at least here in Canada, these same powers that just a few months ago sent in armed RCMP and dogs to remove Wet'suwet'en people from their lands so that the Coastal GasLink pipeline could be forced through their territory, as Pam was telling us about. These same governments which have been refusing to transition the country away from fossil fuel dependence in a time of mounting crisis, climate crisis. So these powers that be are, because of the COVID crisis, are not experiencing a crisis of legitimacy that they were during, for example, the Shut Down Canada movement. So with all the bailouts and funding and support offered, Canadians, if anything, are trusting the powers that be more in this country in this moment. There's almost a sense of new appreciation from some people for the state, for policing, for obedience. So this is also going on at the moment when crisis is opening up some possibilities that weren't open before. That's also a dynamic we need to be really attentive to, and what it means for pushing for the kind of changes that are necessary to build a more socially just and ecologically viable world. So one thing I think the crisis is doing, and we could movements, activists, land defenders can really be helping, is helping shape the narrative right now, the understanding, and helping people see how broken our systems are. As Pam was saying, before this COVID crisis erupted, Canada was already shut down. It was shut down by the rail blockades. And that was showing us already how broken these systems are, how broken by capitalism and colonialism. And yet to the point where the people on the front lines, the people working hardest to defend land and waters and leading the climate fight, were being arrested and removed from their territories. Our systems are clearly broken. And, since the COVID crisis has happened, there has been ongoing, the pipelines have been allowed to keep getting built, even though that means man camps being populated in close density on Indigenous territories, risking putting COVID risk to workers as well as to Indigenous people on those territories. So questions of what is essential work, what is not essential, whose lives are valued, whose lives are not valued, these are important things that are really being raised right now that we need to be having very, very candid, very forthright conversations about. And in Montreal, where I live on unceded Kainai territory, the COVID crisis started in these more wealthy neighborhoods in the West End, where people come back from vacations were infected. But it's only taken, 6 weeks, and now it is the epicenter of the pandemic is in Montreal Nord, which is a highly racialized and a community where a lot of the frontline workers live. So we've seen this move from as the pandemic is hitting people already marginalized by racism and poverty and classism. So we're seeing this, and we need to be learning from this, and we need to be helping more and more people be learning about what these dynamics mean. But my hope is that this crisis and how it's playing out is teaching many more people about not only what's wrong with our systems, but also that much more beautiful, just, and sustainable worlds are possible. As Kim Stanley Robinson wrote in the New Yorker the other day, the virus is rewriting our imaginations. What felt impossible has become thinkable. It's helping people really think about what human well-being is actually based on. Is it based on endless economic growth and accumulation of material wealth? It's helping us sort of think about what we've taken for granted and what we can't anymore. And it's showing us what we're capable of and what our systems are capable of. As my friend and colleague Vijay Kolinjabadi wrote recently in Al Jazeera, the rapid response to COVID-19 around the world illustrates the remarkable capacity of society to put the emergency brakes on business as usual. It shows that we can actually take radical action if we want to. So never again can the government say that bold action on climate change is not possible. They will have to admit they just don't feel like it. So that's a big lesson. And so I'm hoping that this pandemic is really genuinely serving as an opportunity to move us away from relations of exploitation and extraction that our economic and political systems are based on, and towards systems and relations of care and solidarity. So if we can build enough people power to demand that government funding and bailouts are focused on decentralized renewable energy production, protecting vulnerable people, building affordable housing for all, helping build localized food systems, economies based on caring for land and each other, instead of being based on extraction, profit, and economic growth. And I see examples of this all over Montreal. There are new systems growing, systems of mutual aid, of building our own systems of provisions. And so I've really been thinking a lot and working with the Shift Center for Social Transformation Concordia to really think about how this work of mutual aid, of emergency service provision can be done in a way that's aiming for deeper systemic change at the same time. And if anyone's interested, this is for those folks in Montreal, there's funding being offered to support those kind of transformative responses to COVID. So, yeah, during the time of Shutdown Canada, during those really amazing, the most sort of hopeful and transformative time in Canada that I know of the rail blockades, of people standing in solidarity all over the country, I was really thinking about how transformative that moment was and how the power really was shifting. But I also was noticing that many normal, average Canadians were quite scared about the breaking down of the status quo, unsure what this meant for their well-being and security. And so I was thinking at the time a lot about the necessity for activists and scholars and people on the ground building real alternatives and viable solutions to really be communicating how other systems that are not based on extractivism and profit accumulation are possible. So I think that's very true right now too, is in terms of helping seize this crisis as an opportunity for transformation towards justice and sustainability, is helping people visualize, helping people have hope that these much different and more beautiful systems are possible. So how's my time, Fazila? Should I wrap it up? Yeah. Okay. I just have a couple more thoughts. One is that one of the things I have been reflecting on in the book and also in movements that I'm part of is that often the people doing the work of resistance, the frontline people resisting pipeline development, for example, or mines, the work going on there is often quite separate from the work of people who are building, agroecology or permaculture systems, or this work of building the new world and the world of resisting the old is often quite separate. So I've been thinking about different ways that we could leverage the moment by really strategizing on novel ways of combining different strategies. So I've been thinking a lot about that. But yeah, so in the book, there's several parts of the book that really focus or really examine how the people I talk to identify one of the major barriers, internal barriers, being experienced by the social movements that I'm part of, that I talk to, the anti-pipeline movement, the Indigenous land defense movement, and the climate justice movements in Canada. One of the internal barriers is relational tensions and difficulty working across difference. So I'm really thinking about how we could use this time, even though we can't be together in person, how we could be using this time to learning the relational skills we need to be able to work together better across difference, unlearning and undoing some of the ways that the relations of oppression play out and weaken our movements. Let us wake up to how deeply linked the different crises are and help forge, collaborations and new solidarities across diverse movements in Canada. Yeah, so I think there's ways to be seizing these moments for, education, self-education, communication, building those relational skills. and thinking about how to build that better world and communicating that it's possible. But at the same time, doing this in a way that's fundamentally upending the fundamental injustice that this country is based on, which is land theft, the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous people. So what does it mean to be building beautiful systems of mutual aid on stolen Indigenous land? And how do settlers think about building better worlds in ways that are led by Indigenous communities on whose land they are? And what does that look like? So these are some of the discussions I know are going on, are continuing to go on, and I hope we can talk more about that. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that systems level analysis. And I think that we can pick up on a lot of those the things that you and Pam said that are in common, such as the crisis of legitimacy, the crisis that was happening before this pandemic happened. So before our last speaker, I wanted to mention that we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So if you have questions or comments or anything that you want to say, please put them into the live chat, and we're going to be talking about that pretty soon. So our next speaker is David Camfield, who teaches labor studies and sociology at University of Manitoba. He's been involved in social justice organizing for years, and he fuses those two in his writing, which offers ways to move from social theory to social action. So thank you so much, David, for taking the time to be here today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to Pam and Jen for those words. I want to say a few things about the present moment and thinking about it in terms of crises, and then talk about how, because these crises are interconnected, we need interconnected responses, and then close with a few thoughts about strategy. So I think part of what we're experiencing right now in the world, there's obviously more to it than this, but we're having interconnected crises of health with the crisis of the capitalist economy and an ecological crisis. So we've got the pandemic, right? So the coronavirus is not something that exists outside of society. The fact that this virus jumped from animals to humans is connected to the way that capitalist industrial agriculture has encroached on the rest of nature. If we look through history, we see how epidemics have spread through trade and through war. And in this case, we had a virus that moved very, very quickly. First within China, then within 2 weeks beyond China, moving through human networks that run parallel to the supply chains of the global economy, of just-in-time global capitalism. And then this has led to a crisis of life-making, or to some people what they would use a theoretical term for a crisis of social reproduction. That's a way of referring to all the unpaid and paid work that goes on to birth, raise, and educate children, everything that keeps adults alive and able to show up for work to keep producing goods and services in a capitalist society. And so we've obviously seen this pandemic, and the way that the rates of severe illness and death that people experience are really influenced by how likely you are to be exposed to the virus, how healthy you were before you got infected, and the quality of medical care available to you. And all of those things vary depending on who you are. It's not just about age. So the impact of the virus, for example, is worse for people who experience racism because of where they work, where they live, and how their health has been affected previously by living in a racist capitalist society, right? The way that race and class come together. And then we've also seen how the public health measures, which are absolutely necessary to save lives, have also led to widespread loss of jobs or wages, which people need to pay their rent or their mortgage, buy food, buy other necessities, and so on. And this has created this crisis of life-making. So that's one crisis, the health crisis. And then the pandemic triggered, I want to underline it, triggered but did not cause the economic crisis. The economic crisis did not just come out of nothing. Capitalism's been in what some people call a long depression since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. We've seen really low levels of investment, reflecting low rates of profit. States have kept interest rates really low to try to keep more firms afloat and to keep people spending. So we've had a decade where people's job quality has gone down, many people's debt levels have gone up, making people more vulnerable to losses of income. late 2019, there were already signs of a new recession, and now the pandemic has triggered an extremely sharp one. An article that was published recently in a really good new journal called Spectre, it's on the website of Spectre, pointed out that capitalism's ability to produce its own lifeblood, that is profit, utterly depends on the daily quote-unquote production of workers. And what's happened then with the public health measures that were needed to save lives is it's really disrupted capitalist production and caused profits to plummet. And we can expect that long after the pandemic subsides, we're going to be in an economic crisis. How long that crisis lasts and how severe it is and what shape it takes is going to be affected a lot, not just by what firms do, but by what states do. And unfortunately, sooner or later, we can expect to face more attacks on jobs and services in the public sector, both governments and government-funded organizations. We can expect to see more privatization moves. In other words, we can see altogether more austerity as governments move to try to reduce their deficits. They will be taking advantage of a slogan that some people might have heard of, a line, never let a serious crisis go to waste. And so there will certainly be forces looking to take advantage of this crisis to pursue their agendas. We can already see this in some places, certainly where I live in Manitoba, the provincial government's jumping the gun and bringing in some austerity measures right now. And then we have the ecological crisis, which is crucially about climate change, but not only about climate change. Just as a reminder, if greenhouse gas emissions match current government policies, they may be worse than that, but if they match current government policies, Climate Action Tracker is telling us that we're estimating 3 degrees of warming above pre-industrial temperatures by the end of the 21st century, when we should, of course, be trying to limit it to 1.5 degrees at the most, or 2 degrees. It's not just climate change, though. We also have biodiversity loss, extinctions, the acidification of oceans, pollution of air, water, and soil, and so on. All of this coming from the underlying cause of capitalism's relentless drive to produce more commodities ever faster, driven by the competition for profits. It's that competition which underpins what some people talk about as a growth paradigm. And capitalism is fossil capitalism. Fossil fuels are woven through it in so many different ways. There's one other crisis that I think in this part of the world we haven't yet experienced, but we're probably also going to experience in the future, and that's a political crisis of the kind that's been happening in lots of places since the Great Recession. So back in 2008, 2009, that recession and all the fallout from it, the bailouts, the austerity, and so on, really weakened mainstream neoliberal political forces, made it harder for them to rule in the old way. Their legitimacy went down. And so we've seen in many places the growth of both the hard right, people like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, for example, and even further right-wing forces, but then also the growth of a bolder left, symbolized by figureheads like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders. So that kind of political crisis has not yet gripped the Canadian state, but I think that we're probably going to see one in the years ahead as this recession, this economic crisis, with the other crises continues. So interconnected crises call for an interconnected response, right? The crises are distinct, but we need to respond together because they're not separate. And I just want to mention here that the small organization, The Leap, has come out with a really interesting document called The People's Bailout, which talks about how to respond in an interconnected way, talking about relief, recover, and reimagine. It's 3 different dimensions. So they've come out with policy demands around housing, healthcare, and work. They're still working on proposals for transportation, education, and food, but I think this deserves a lot of attention. When they talk about relief, they talk about trying to meet people's immediate life and death needs, the needs of frontline workers and everybody else whose life has been upended by the crisis. Demands such as housing for all, immediate self-determined funding for Indigenous communities, a ban on evictions, making sure that everyone has access to healthcare regardless of their citizenship status, making sure all healthcare workers have the personal protective equipment that they need. There's full and equal access to income support and other protections for workers. We raise the minimum wage and social assistance. Those are some of their demands. In terms of relief, when it comes to recover, they talk about government spending geared to building the scaffolding for a zero-carbon, full-employment economy. So that's everything from building zero-carbon public housing, putting unused buildings into public ownership. There's a lot of those. Stronger rights for renters, including rent control, full public drug plan, an end to for-profit medicine, building a network of community health centers, improving long-term care, making it easier to form, grow, and strengthen unions, and begin a just transition from fossil fuels with a huge polluter pays job creation program and a federal program to retrain workers. And when they go beyond that to talk about reimagining, they're talking about transforming the economy to prioritize safety for all, not just the 1%. And as they say, that means a global Green New Deal. So what would that involve? Such things as land back, starting with the return of publicly owned and crown land to Indigenous nations, taking privately owned empty properties and moving them into community land banks, universal health care to cover every part of every body, including eye care, dental care, mental health care, the decriminalization of all drug use and health support for users, universal public quality elder care, and a federal government guarantee of a good green job for everyone who needs one, putting the economy increasingly under democratic control with a vast expansion of care work. So these are great ideas. It's a far-reaching package of climate justice reforms. Now, that doesn't address everything. We also need measures to specifically try to dismantle settler colonialism. And in Indigenous organizing south of the Canada-US border, we've seen the Red Deal come up as an idea to complement the Green New Deal, and that is an important document to consider. But it's really jarring how, these are bold and ambitious, really vital demands, but they're really, there's a jarring clash between these kinds of demands and the way that governments have lowered our expectations for decades. What's interesting, though, there have been many, many things wrong with the way governments have responded to the pandemic, ways in which their response has been tilted towards employers and landlords. But despite those limitations, and when we think particularly about the CERB and the orders that have closed most workplaces, they've actually raised many working class people's expectations about what they can expect. They've shown that governments can act on a grand scale to save lives and to shield people from the pressure to either show up to work or end up in desperate poverty or homeless. So I think there's something we can take advantage of that there. But this does bring up the question of strategy and how we could win a people's bailout and how we could win any of these kinds of climate justice reforms. Because fine policies don't get implemented just because they're rational. We know that. And having compelling stories about how we could respond to crises from a climate justice perspective is not going to persuade political parties committed to capitalism, whether neoliberal capitalism or some other future way of organizing capitalism, to change their ways, right? Our problem is not a lack of policies. I think the problem is not that we lack ways of talking about the world that we want. Our fundamental problem is that the forces that support the kind of change that's needed are weak, dispersed, often unorganized, or when they are organized, we're often very fragmented. When you look to the political parties, the leaders of the NDP and the Green Party are not open to a people's bailout. And I think we have to give up the false hope that somehow we could persuade them to take up that fight. There may be some MPs or MLAs that support those things, and of course, now is the time for them to come out publicly, regardless of what their party leaders say. But if we, I think, look to history, we can remind ourselves and explain to others that it really does take militant social movements, mass social movements, to win major reforms. And think back 2012, the so-called Red Square movement in Quebec, something on that scale and then some is what we're going to need. When people talk about the Green New Deal in the US context, they're talking about drawing on the memory of the New Deal of the 1930s when the broad welfare state was built in the US. So that's been very inspirational for some people. But often what's forgotten there is that that was the outcome in part of widespread militant protests by unemployed people and by farmers happening long before Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. And then after he was elected, protests by tenants organizations, workers going on strike, and so on. The historian Howard Zinn talks about this as a real rebellion. And I think it's, again, a real rebellion is what would be needed to win a people's bailout. No one has a magic recipe for creating an upheaval of that kind. But there are lots of things we can be doing to organize in and around where we live, where we work, where we study. Often today, organizing online, unfortunately, but getting out in person as soon as we can. Doing all these things in ways that would sow the seeds for the kinds of rebellion that would be needed. And I think as we do this, we need to think about the way that we should argue for a people's bailout. But for a lot of people, it's going to seem a good idea that's just really unrealistic. And so we also have to be involved in, small fights against austerity, for small reforms, for example, around better public transit. There are lots of things that people can be organizing around, because it's the process of organizing for change that's so important in how people shift their thinking, how people's expectations get raised, and how we build social movements. So just to close, I think it's never been more important than it is today to take to heart what the abolitionist Frederick Douglass famously said: if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Thank you so much. I've been getting some questions over text, so we can start with those. If anyone else has questions who are listening and watching live, please let us know in the comments, or through Twitter. You can do that as well. We're going to start a discussion with the panelists here. Thank you so much for your insights. The first question that we received is kind of, I think, related to what all of you have said, and specifically, what is the difference between Indigenous land defense and environmental activism when it comes to what's happening right now? Jen or Pam, you want to take that one?
I can have a go. I can have first go. I was in a workshop with Chelsea Vowell. She gave a workshop to environmentalists in Quebec maybe 5-6 years ago, and someone asked her, "What's the thing that you find hardest or most annoying about working with environmentalists?" And she said, "The concept of the environment. The way in the Western worldview we somehow separate the environment from social justice or from anti-poverty work, or this kind of thing, the idea that the environment is something out there to be saved. That's a very settler Western conception that makes collaborating around land struggles really frustrating." So I think that's one difference. In the book, my book opens up with a story about the climate march. 500,000 people hit the street in Montreal on September 27th, and it was led by Indigenous youth, who were later that day during the march aggressed with racial violence from settler activists, climate activists, who said, "This is not your land. This is Quebecois land." So there's this way that settler climate activists can actually think that they can solve the climate problem without understanding ongoing settler colonialism and the way that capitalism has built the problem. Like that's, yeah, it's still environmentalism in Canada. There's still some environmentalists, less and less all the time, who do not see the fundamental links between the different crises, the crises of racial inequality in Canada, settler colonialism, etc., and the climate crisis. They just see environment as something, and they're just framing it in terms of like they want their future to be safe, and this, they want to sustain the kind of well-being that they have as privileged white people, and they somehow frame their climate activism like that. So that's not my climate activism, and that's definitely not the kind of climate activism that Indigenous land defenders have been leading. So those are just some of the differences that I see.
I'll just add a little bit to that, just from an Indigenous perspective. Everything about our identity and our culture and our traditions, our practices, even our language and ideologies and governance and relationships are all interconnected with land and water and plants and animals and insects and the spirit world and our past ancestors and our future generations. It's all very intertwined. It's an inherent part of our identity. So it's not like we can just take one part and say, let's save this one lake, as if not addressing the clear cutting over here, which has a devastating impact on the lake, and then all the fish, and then all the animals that rely on the fish aren't going to be inherently mixed together. I will say a lot has changed from when I was younger in terms of conservationists, environmentalists, social justice activists, anti-poverty activists, like more and more and more and more as they work with Indigenous peoples, who we're not doing this, I guess, in a discipline, so to speak. We're not like a group. It's everything about who we are. And, you know, we live and die on our lands. Many people have shown that they're willing to put their bodies and their life on the line for this. And it's not a phase, and it's not a job. It's not something we do as volunteer, that it's very much intertwined in who we are. And it has been very much criminalized in a way that it's not criminalized the same. Historically, it hasn't been criminalized the same way for conservationists, environmentalists, and you know, animal rights protectors. There were times when there was clashes with the law, but Indigenous peoples continue to be portrayed as criminals and violent and dangerous and in need of literally bringing out tanks in the army when we stand up for the land, in a way that it's quite not the same. And the only reason why we're here today as Indigenous land defenders is because we've continued to be criminally Indigenous. And when I say criminally Indigenous, that means we continue to defend our laws and our sovereignty and our territories and our obligations. Notice I didn't say rights, but our obligations to protect all of this, you know, ecosystem of the planet. But we are violating the unjust laws of settler governments, which is what makes us criminals. And the only way that we're going to save this planet is if we can convince other human beings from all backgrounds and persuasions, it doesn't matter what your passion is, to be criminally human, you know, and to stand up and say, although these are laws, technically they're unjust laws, and we have to look at it together. And I really appreciate what the other panelists were talking about working together and finding ways to work together, because we're never going to agree on everything and all the details of the path forward and all of the procedures, but that's not what it's about. It's a big picture. And one of the things I really appreciate from Indigenous land defenders that I've learned from over the decades is the big picture. Win or lose little tiny battles, we're always in it for the long haul. Like Indigenous peoples are always in this for the long haul. And so the more we can get other human beings and other groups to kind of see it for the long haul and see it holistically, I think we got this. I think we're going to have that rebellion, and the legitimacy is going to be legitimately challenged, and we will make these changes. And I think one of the best things that came out of this horrible pandemic is that transnational corporations and governments couldn't stop the world from seeing what happens when we take drastic action. The air clears, the waters start to clear, the animals reoccupy their spaces, human beings start reconnecting, and all of these things we didn't think were possible. And when I say we, I mean the collective we. People were constantly challenging. There's no possible way we can have an impact on the earth. Well, look at this short time, what an astounding impact we've had. So imagine if we did it in a way that was people-friendly and earth-friendly and didn't focus on growth and profit, which is just unrealistic, but focus on, look at the change we can do. And, you know, we've shown that we can do it.
Thank you for that. One of the things I was thinking about that is common between a lot of the things that you've said is that there is now, and before the pandemic happened, a crisis of legitimacy of power. And a few of you have talked about how this could create the way for more austerity, and despite the fact that the governments have been acting quite grandly, and as you say, Pam, have shown that this is possible, and that people have shown that this is possible even before this pandemic was happening. How do you think that this is going to play out, once we can come out of our houses? What kind of strategies do you see being most effective?
Who's your question for?
Everyone. We can start with maybe we can start with David, and then Jen, and then Pam. I think all of you have something to say about that.
I guess I'll say a couple of things, but I mean, I think it's going to, unfortunately, it's not going to be as simple as when we get to come out of our houses, because we're going to, I think, have more than one wave of this. I mean, it's not clear, of course, and I'm no epidemiologist, but there's going to be a protracted period of, and we'll see how this happens. We're just beginning this week in Manitoba to have some reopenings, I think, prematurely, unfortunately, but Manitoba is one of the least affected places in terms of infections. But I think we're going to see once things subside with the pandemic, that there is going to be a drive to basically, because there's been such a great level of state spending around this, there's going to be all these voices which are going to argue, now everyone's got to tighten their belts. We had to do this for the common good, they'll say, and now everybody's going to have to accept less, maybe pay higher taxes in some cases, but we'll see what they want to go after first. But it might be difficult for them. But the forces, the ideology of the debt reduction and so on, and all the pressure that from the international markets that are connected to that, I think those are going to be very, very real. And so there's going to have to be a fight back organized against that, and to argue for debt relief, a global debt jubilee, I think is a really important demand to be thinking about, because it's not just, obviously we have lots of ordinary people in Canada carrying completely unmanageable debt loads, but the incredible debt loads of countries in the global south as a result of the of imperialism, in a word, that those things need to be taken on. So we're going to be finding ourselves in a political situation that's going to be, quite different from what we've experienced, because this is the worst economic crisis of global capitalism since the 1930s, and how that plays out in terms of what states will do, how much spending they're going to continue to need in order to try to put some wind in the sails of the economy, how much they'll turn to austerity. This is going to be something we're going to be dealing with for years, long after the pandemic subsides. And I don't have any kind of crystal ball about, more specifically how we're going to respond to this. But I think we need to be aware of some of the big contours.
I think David raises some really good points, and even if you just kind of deconstruct the question, what's going to happen post-pandemic when we come out of our houses, presumes, that's a question for people with houses.
Yeah.
What about the homeless people that they put in temporary hotels or temporary tents or temporary shelters? What about all of the people who don't have houses and who weren't sheltered? What happens to them? And all of the First Nations who in fact won't be coming out of their houses because provinces opening up prematurely. It's just beyond my comprehension how we could have so much illness and death in all these countries, and provinces even to consider to have widespread openings actually puts the lives of other people who don't have a choice at risk. So if you think about all of the teachers, if they're forced to go back to work or lose your job What about those with all, compromised health conditions and children? What about all the First Nations who we know are very vulnerable populations because of colonization, because of all the ill health and lack of water and all of these other situations? And we have some segments in society who aren't as reasonable or respectful of human rights. So you think about some who will be demanding their ability to go into Haida Gwaii or to go into Mi'kmaq territory and, set up their tents and have their summer parties and do all of these things, risking life and health of Indigenous peoples who are doing their very best to keep their borders closed and have really no decision-making power. So that's part of the problem here. You have the Minister of Indian Affairs, it's called Aboriginal or Indigenous Affairs now, giving lots of updates and talking about what they're doing, but there's no decision-making power on behalf of the sovereign nations to protect themselves in these circumstances. When people start coming out of their houses, but First Nations don't in order to protect their populations, what's the plan for them? What's the plan for all the rape crisis shelters and the group homes and, all of these scenarios? We still have a crisis in prisons and youth corrections with COVID-19. That hasn't even been addressed yet, let alone what's going to happen when they, essentially open our front doors means they'll be transferring people back into these institutions. And I think part of the problem here is that we've institutionalized people and the planet for far too long and forgotten about all of the ones who are not paying taxes, who are not the ones voting, who are not sitting on corporate boards. And we really need a shift in power and decision making, and only the people together can take that back. And I really believe that that's only going to come from solidarity. And that what's going to happen in the next few weeks will be a real illustration of the challenges we're going to have to face moving ahead, what governments do, and that's yet to be seen.
I want to pick up on what Pam was saying about only through people together can that taking power back. And I want to link that to something really inspiring work going on in communities in Montreal, organizing mutual aid. And I'm really inspired by that phrase I've been seeing around saying, get organized and stay organized, where communities are figuring out how to self-organize to make sure people are getting fed, people are getting the medicine they need, people are getting, they're taking care of each other. So these new systems are being forged, and how do you build them in a way that continues to function and continues to strengthen and continues to figure out ways to take care in ways that no one is getting left behind. And so how do you keep that going to the point that it's like the building this dual power concept, this idea that if communities can do this sort of localized self-organization of mutual aid, that you could slowly become less dependent on the state, thus allowing people to have more confidence in actually resisting the state. Like Kevin McKay, who wrote the book recently, Radical Transformation, he talks about people have rational aversion to this talk about taking down the state because we are dependent on the state. The state provides us with medication and food and all these kinds of things that we don't know how we provide for ourselves. So I think somehow thinking about how we keep these mutual aid things being developed and growing to the point where it can sort of build this kind of dual power where people are not so afraid to really confront the state, and then from that to collaboratively work together to become good at devising policies and strategies for ourselves that leave no one behind, that don't sacrifice any people or non-human people in order to make the systems that we're creating work, because we can create systems that work for all in these localized mutual aid ways. So that's where I'm feeling a lot of hope, and I'm hoping, sort of building towards a solidarity economy thing, thus weakening the power that the state has over us or the systems have over us because we feel so dependent on them. That's where my current hope is.
So picking up on the state, Joy K is asking a question about some ways that the international community, civil society, and organizations can collaborate on environmental protection against state surveillance and resistance. So I think that kind of it plays on austerity, it grows it. State surveillance and resistance is one of the things that we're going to be facing in the future, and more so than already happens. So can either of you speak to that?
Either of who? Who are you asking, Fazila?
I think that David was the person who spoke the most about austerity. So if you have thoughts about state surveillance and resistance, then please go ahead and talk about that.
Okay, it's a question I hadn't thought would come up. But I mean, I'll only say that there's been a lot of, activist wisdom, if you like, about dealing with state surveillance in recent years. It is, obviously it's a real challenge. I do think it's important to avoid paranoia about it, because it can be quite paralyzing to obsess about it too much. I think we have to be, realistic about what it's like to live under this kind of a state, not think that we can somehow avoid it, but we can challenge and push back in all sorts of ways and organize in ways that are savvy and make state surveillance less disruptive. But it really comes back to what kinds of organizations are we building, what kind of grassroots connections are we building, what kind of relationships are we building, how are we doing that? Those are some of the most important, I guess, bedrock things that we can use to respond to state surveillance and state repression. And we just have to think about this as well when there are ideas being floated about the use of surveillance technologies to respond to for contact tracing and so on in relation to the pandemic. I think that's quite concerning.
I would just take the moment to plug 2 Fernwood books that I recently got. One is called Policing Black Lives. It's by Robin Maynard, and that's really great. And another book also from Fernwood called Policing Indigenous Movements. That was I've just started reading that. It seems like there's a lot to be learned in those books for understanding the way the surveillance has been used to quell resistance in the past. And also there's some good articles going around. I saw one the other day called "We Can't Police Our Way Out of the Crisis." So there's good work going on thinking through that people can Google and order books. That's all I wanted to share.
Okay, so there are some questions here about the Green New Deal. There's one for each of you. So they're all related. To Pam, how do Indigenous anti-colonial activists interpret the Green New Deal? To Jen, how does the Green New Deal fit in with a radical anti-capitalist eco approach? And to David, is the Green New Deal compatible with anti-colonial, anti-capitalist struggle?
Interesting questions. Well, I mean, the first one, there is no one Indigenous voice or one Indigenous viewpoint or one Indigenous perspective, politically, culturally, socially, or legally. And we all consider these all these different ideas in different ways. I mean, what the Haudenosaunee feel, or the Haida, or the Wet'suwet'en, or the Mi'kmaq, it's going to be different based on, where we are, what our experiences are. Like the Mi'kmaq in the East, for example, we've experienced colonization for 500 long years, whereas it's been shorter in BC, for example. So we all have different experiences. And even those of us in the movement now, as land defenders or resistors or those engaged in cultural revitalization, we all have different perspectives too. Sadly, colonization has been very effective in dividing us and politicizing and oppression has been quite effective. When it comes to the Green New Deal or the Red Deal or anybody's idea, and to me it doesn't matter where it originates so long as it doesn't originate from government, because every time it originates from government for Native people, it always means death and destruction. So, but people on the outside and activists and people who are really truly trying to make a difference, my approach is always to try to pick out all the things I can work with that are in harmony or that work with what we're trying to do, and try to focus on that. And it never matters to me who's the actual person behind it or the group behind it or what it's called or, any of the semantics stuff. I know words are important, but I try to focus on the big picture. And if in this context here at this time, this is a way, one of the many ways to protect lands and waters, great. And if in another context it's a different deal or a different concept or a different idea, great. And there may be things I don't agree with, so I won't participate in that stuff. But I think we need to keep trying to find the areas where we're coming together and where the core of it is, respecting Native sovereignty and land rights, social justice and earth justice. I mean, these are all very basic things that I think we can just focus on that bigger picture and agree to disagree on the stuff that we don't. But I think it's important to understand, for whoever asked that there is no one Indigenous voice on this, and that's okay, because we are all different sovereign nations. Just like it's okay for different countries to have different opinions on things, it's okay to have different ideas. That in and of itself is not conflict. Where the conflict comes from is when one tries to dominate another. And so as long as we always find a process to negotiate and work out these things, I think we'll be okay in terms of our solidarity moving forward. There's always going to be bumps and bruises, but it's well worth it for what we're going to get out of it in the end, which is a radical change to everything.
I can go next. So the Green New Deal, there's a lot I really value about the process and the document. By the way, there's several versions of it. There's like Courage Coalition came up with the Green New Deal of the North. There's been different attempts to come up with this document that encapsulates a vision for the world we want, and a lot of them are really powerful. And what I really appreciate is that this need to be able to articulate the world we want, which is not that easy, because if you think about the kind of different groups or communities or activists that are involved with these overlapping and diverse movements, we're not all after the same end goal, right? Like some people's end goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Other people's goal is to, achieve Indigenous sovereignty and rebuild Indigenous nations. Other people's goal is to take down the state. Like these are very different end goals but we're all sort of collaborating together. And so to have any kind of collaborative articulation of a common sort of vision that we could all sort of get behind. I know not everyone gets behind everything in the Green New Deal in its current form, but I think it's the best these movements have come up with in terms of articulating some shared end goal, or where our diverse end goals overlap, like the Venn diagram of all our visions of the world we want. So I value that, the process that went into that, and trying to get as many people at the table to draft that. But what I value it more for being able to be something that unifies or creates cohesion across movements, as opposed to it being something we're asking the government to heed or provide for us, because I also think that that's not that's going to be, not that we could ignore what's going on in the government's, what we need to pay close attention, movements need to pay attention, but we also, I think we need to put all our eggs in the basket of the state to provide what the world we want to bring about. I think that's communities and movements have got to do that work. Hopefully the government will be get out of the way enough to let that happen. But so I like the vision. It's as good as we have. I like it for the cohesion vision, more so than asking the government to provide stuff for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Than
And I guess I would say, I mean, the question is the Green New Deal compatible with anti-capitalist, anti-colonial struggle? First question I would have is, well, which Green New Deal? Because as Jen was just saying, right, there's different versions of this. There's some versions that are talking about basically greening settler colonial capitalism and nothing more than that. And then there are also more radical versions of the Green New Deal, which really are about a big package of climate justice reforms that are also anti-colonial. So that's one question, and it's a little more complicated here in the Canadian state because we don't have the same number of elaborated Green New Deal documents as exist in the U.S. But in terms of the general idea, I think we have to ask which Green New Deal, and then also ask what are we going to do with it, because some beautiful text is actually not going to change the world, right? No matter how wonderful the demands are and how well crafted it is. So I think the question is, what do people do with it in terms of how we organize and how do we use it for movement building? I think that's a really important question. So I think there certainly are versions of the Green New Deal which are really valuable for moving in an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, climate justice movement building direction.
Thank you for that. I think I'm going to take two more questions, one of them being pretty direct. Anthony Gracie is saying, I'm wondering what everyone's thoughts are on universal basic income. So do you want to start with that, David, since you were just speaking about change?
Okay, I think it's largely a dangerous Trojan horse. In that, I think people can come up with wonderful schemes for a universal basic income, but any kind of basic income scheme that we're actually going to get is not going to come right now from the left and reflect those kinds of concerns. It's going to be something that's acceptable to the current government and to employers in the current balance of forces, right? We're not going to get something that comes out of some think tank or workshop. What kind of social policy will get brought in, whether it's basic income or something else, is going to reflect the balance of social forces, the balance of power in society. And the idea that we're going to somehow, because it's simply a good idea, going to get a basic income that would be paid at a really level high enough that it would allow people to choose it over the worst kinds of minimum wage jobs, it's just not going to happen, unfortunately, with the balance of power that we have right now. You imagine what low-wage employers will say to the idea that somehow the state would provide people an alternative to working for them in their crappy jobs. And so, although I think a lot of support for basic income comes from a good place, people are hopeful that look to the current system of EI and social assistance and recognize how bad it is. There's a real risk that a basic income scheme could be used to actually make things worse for lots of people. Because you can be given a basic income, but if you don't have access to quality public services, you're going to be worse off, right? You could end up with a basic income system easily that's worse than the current system. So I think we have to be very careful and recognize that, again, we're not going to, what we'll get will depend on what we're powerful enough to win. And at the moment, a basic income scheme could easily be part of an attack on the past gains that we have, however inadequate they are.
Those are very good points. Do you have anything to say, Jen or Pam, on the topic of a basic income?
I would just say that I'm really interested in solutions that tackle root causes of problems. So if poverty is a problem, yes, does basic income, universal basic income, dig at what's driving ongoing economic inequality, it's driving poverty? Probably not. So maybe it could be part of a bigger thing. I mean, ideally that would help people get by at the same time as tackling the underlying drivers of poverty. It reminds me of benefit agreements to Indigenous communities to try to convince them to allow extractive projects on their property or on their territory, and then, but not understanding that the underlying driver of poverty is that there's not enough land base on reserves to create an economic base. And so poverty has got these systemic roots. And so throwing money at it doesn't stop that land back. Returning indigenous land to indigenous territories solves that. It digs at the roots, and it's like a more deeply effective solution. So when I think about the basic universal income, I think it depends on what other kind of things, like David was saying, what it would come with. It could be transformative, and it could be just a stopgap or a Band-Aid that's not transformative.
I really like the idea and the spirit in which I believe it's coming from most people. This idea, just a general idea that to make sure everybody is provided for, especially those who are in situations where they can't, temporarily or long term, in a way that's not bare subsistence, just barely surviving. But I think we all have different ideas of what a universal basic income would be, and what is all of the quid pro quo, or all of the conditions that go along with it. So is there here, everybody gets $20,000 a year as a basic income who needs it. Oh, but by the way, you pay for your own dental care, your mental health care, all of these healthcare services. There's going to be no more shelters. There's going to be no more homeless shelters. There's going to be no more housing assistance, public. Like, there is so much that we have to consider. So I've always been supportive of making sure, while we're trying to deal with all of these horrendous root causes, capitalism and land theft and disproportionate power and all of these other things, having safety nets for people. My concern, like what David said, is what is the quid pro quo? And think about in history, whenever we try to have a policy or a plan that's one size fits all. So, one man getting a basic income of $20,000 is in a different position than a woman with 6 kids, one which has, special educational needs, and the other one has special health needs. The $20,000 in those two circumstances work very differently. And then that doesn't even speak to Indigenous peoples. So we have a whole bunch of issues around treaty rights that aren't being respected or implemented, around health and education and other treaty rights and benefits. And my fear would be all of that would be lumped into this. Well, you get a basic income like everyone else, when in fact we're in a very different position. And it's hard to take people who have been historically disadvantaged and oppressed and say, okay, now everybody is at the same level. I really like the idea. I think everyone in society, everyone should be safe and secure and have access to food and water and healthcare, and not subsistence either. But to be able to go to school or university or trade school, if that's what they want to do, or to be able to stay home and take care of their kids so that these kids are loved and healthy and happy. Like, whatever it is that people want to do, we should have a social safety net that allows it. There's lots of realistic options that work in different parts of the world. So it's not like we're talking about something that's just, beyond the realm of the possible. Like, imagine, childcare for people so that they could work if they wanted to, but work not as mandatory, work not as the basis of everything. And so with all of those many, 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 many provisos, I like the idea of making sure everyone's provided for. I don't know if you call that a basic income, but without suffering all of the punishments that governments are notorious for. Oh, if we give over here, we take over here. The kind of shell game. But things like a basic income, they could make a huge difference in the lives of currently homeless people or precariously housed, low-wage workers, assuming the basic income was decent, people who get out of prison. Think about what prison is right now. Whether you have a 6-month sentence or a 25-year sentence, they're all a life sentence. They all reduce your life opportunities, your ability to work, your ability to, provide for yourself in the future, or the day you get out of prison with no home, no job, no connections. So there's lots of circumstances where we should have all of these protections in place. But I think from everything that's been said, there's a lot of cautions that go along with, what it is that's being asked for and then what's given up. And I don't think anyone who's promoting basic income is thinking that, oh, well, we'll give up all these other things. I don't think that's in their mind, but we always have to worry about what will come out of it from the government mind, from the legislative perspective, from the Treasury Board perspective. And it's never, ever the good ideas that we put forward. So I worry about that.
Thank you so much. I think that we should probably end it there. This conversation has been so expansive, from the health concerns to the environmental concerns to the fact that there were crises before this crisis, to strategies. And I just want to really appreciate you all for your time. Thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that the books on our site, including the books of the brilliant speakers you've heard today, are 24% off until May 14th with the code MAYDAY20. And Radical May happens all month long. So a lot of other publishers are putting on events of a similar nature. And you can find the calendar for Radical May at radicalmay.literalbcn.cat. The link will be in the comments. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thank you for your questions. And goodbye.